Welcome to the Corporate Director Podcast, where we discuss the experiences and ideas behind what's working in corporate board governance in our digital tech-fueled world. Here, you'll discover new insights from corporate leaders and governance researchers with compelling stories about corporate governance, strategy, board culture, risk management, digital transformation, and more.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Corporate Director Podcast, the voice of modern governance. My name is Dottie Schindlinger, Executive Director of the Diligent Institute, and I'm joined once again by my amazing co-host, Megan Day, Principal Solution Designer here at Diligent. Megan, Happy New Year. How you doing?
Happy New Year, Dottie. And you're going to have to update my title. I am moving into the risk and audit business unit at Diligent. So I am taking a little shift yet again, but excited to focus on all things risk. I think it's a very timely and important subject to tackle here at Diligent, that's for sure.
Well, absolutely. And boy, that announcement couldn't come on a better day because we had the opportunity to interview Craig Stronberg from the PwC Intelligence Center. And all we did was talk about risk, Megan. So I think this is an interview that you're going to really enjoy.
Well, I'm excited to give it a listen. I mean, not only have I sort of moved in and taken on this new role related to risk, but I think it's coming at the perfect time, as I think this interview alludes to. The world is in a really interesting place, and we are now more than ever, I think, have to reevaluate what risk and risk management looks like.
I think that's really right. You'll hear in the interview, Craig and I talk about that quite a bit. And especially here we are on the cusp of the inauguration of the Trump administration, as he calls it, Trump 2.0. And, there's a lot of questions. What is this going to look like for the business community? What can we expect from international trade policy? We've been hearing lots of things about tariffs. What can we expect about supply chain? What can we expect about other regulatory policy and how things are shifting? So why don't we give the interview a listen and we'll come back and talk a little bit about what we heard.
Perfect.
Joining us on the Corporate Director Podcast today is Craig Stronberg, Senior Director at PwC Intelligence. Craig, thanks so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So all I've done is tell people your name and your title. Could you share with our audience a little bit more about what you do at PwC and just sort of what PwC Intelligence is all about?
So PwC Intelligence is an entity that helps it understand the market, the complex operating environment, how our competitors are working, and what's happening in the macroeconomic and geopolitical space. And we do that with a lot of tradecraft in these areas. We produce a lot of analysis. We talk to a lot of the firm's leadership every single day. I come from a background in intelligence of 20 years in the U.S. intelligence community, and so do many of my colleagues from similar backgrounds and similar years of experience. So we have a wonderful team. We have outstanding exposure to the leadership, and we have one of the better jobs in the firm.
Well, you're definitely the right person for us to talk to today, because I know we wanted to dig in a little bit on some of the things that we might be able to expect coming out of the new presidential administration taking office in early next year. So, as the new administration does come into office, we've been asking directors in some of our pulse surveys to list the government policies that they think are most likely to impact businesses in 2025. So some of the things they listed included corporate taxes, industry regulation, international trade, supply chain issues. Those are really the top three. But I'd love to hear, how you're anticipating the policies of the Trump administration are going to influence, especially the regulatory environment for businesses. What are some of the sectors you think are going to be most affected?
So the first thing that I would say is that all of us, and I'm seeing a lot of this in the conversations that I'm having in the market, need to beware of recency bias. Like, he was only here 4 years ago, right? He is fresh in people's minds. I think there is probably going to be a difference between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0, right? He seems to be more disciplined, more structured. He's picking different kinds of people, and he understands the job to a depth that he did not when he became president. So I think he will do some things, right, the same, but he will do some things different. And one of the things that I think is going to be different is, especially when it comes to issues surrounding supply chain, foreign investment, and exports, one of the things that I think we're going to see is a tighter connection between the White House and Congress, not just because they are from the same party, but because you have very experienced legislators like Marco Rubio, who will very likely or almost certainly have very high positions in the cabinet. And that will allow him to create new law with more efficiency and probably more drive than he did in the first term. I think there's a cocktail that I'm worried about. And the cocktail, and there's probably a DC joke to be made here that I'm not funny enough to do, where it's this mix of protectionism, national security, and supply chain. And if you look at the Venn diagram of these, that Venn diagram where they overlap is squarely in the bullseye of the last 6 years of presidential administration and congressional action. And it's important to understand that the protectionist policy that Trump started was expanded and continued by President Biden, and it's going to be picked up again by President Trump and expanded further. So there is broad agreement on both sides in Congress that this bullseye, this overlap in the Venn diagram needs more attention. From a sector point of view, the two sectors that have had the most to worry about thus far have been technology and manufacturing, because they are the most heavily reliant on China. I think now there are a couple of others that are going to be added to that list. I think chemicals, healthcare, pharma, and FS, financial services / PE, are next up. Financial services and PE, by the way, because the U.S. government is going to want U.S. financial sector entities to help U.S. businesses potentially encourage other U.S. MNCs to invest less in China. So they're also going to be part of the conversation and probably part of the target. But that, from a sector point of view, that's how I see this.
So, Craig, one of the areas you talked about in that Venn diagram was supply chain. And I want to double click on that for a moment and talk a little bit about what you're expecting from the new administration's stance on international trade. I'm trying to sort of understand, what can we expect in terms of how that's going to impact multinational corporations and their operations, as well as supply chain in addition. So what are your thoughts about that?
So this is probably the question, right, that I'm getting the most in the last 6 weeks with a high degree of intensity for a good reason. So I think there are going to be some things that are different. I do, though, want to repeat what I said in answer to the first question, which is I know that these are very different people. The past two presidents, their policies on supply chain are very similar. And while they talk about this differently, both have been very disruptive to multinational companies. And that's going to continue is sort of the bottom line up front here. So first of all, anything that has to do with China is going to be under more scrutiny. And it's very hard for many sectors not to have a supply chain that ultimately doesn't link back to China. I think one of the things that is probably going to be more of a focus in Washington, not just from him, but from Congress, is wanting to understand at a sector by sector level and a company by company level, where do U.S. companies source and produce down to the component level? So if you are a company and you don't know what sourcing you have by country in your technology or your goods, and that includes data, by the way, like even if you're not producing something and you're producing something that is a digital good or a digital asset, what part of that data comes from other countries? Washington is going to want to know more of that. I see no reason to not take him at his word and believe he's going to launch some tariffs day one. I think the one thing I would say that I don't know that the market is pricing in is that China will probably retaliate harder in a trade war than it did last time. And some of the actions that you have seen Beijing take in the last 3 or 4 weeks, which appear at first glance to be a reaction to the current administration, I think are much more of a warning to the incoming administration about the type of actions that they would unleash against sectors, against the economy as a whole, and against individual companies if a new trade war starts. So that is something that I think more companies need to price in as they look at the next 4 years.
So it seems like there's sort of 3 areas of focus that are coming up in this conversation, broadly speaking: tax policy, regulation, international trade. How well do those 3 areas align with what you've been seeing and hearing as priority areas for businesses in 2025? Are these the things that they are paying attention to, or are they paying attention to other things and are concerned that these 3 things could derail what they've already got planned?
No, I think those are 3 of the top priorities. I think part of the problem is that every one of the 3 things that you mentioned, right? Tax, regulation, international trade, is often handled by a different person in the company. And that leader, whoever he or she may be, is often informed by a very different risk metric and risk understanding. In the current geopolitical environment, risk is calling out to be reimagined. Our old understanding of risk, especially at the board and the C-suite level, is completely outdated. It is there for a world that works, a world in which normalcy can be expected, even if there are geopolitical crises. We are not in that world any longer. We'll get there someday, but we aren't going to be there anytime soon. And so if you are a tax director, or you are a director in charge of supply chain, you don't, in most companies, some companies do, but in most companies, you don't have a single source of current, updated, integrated risk intelligence to go to help you all convey your decisions upward to the C-suite and the board to make better decisions in these three areas. I think these three have their own challenges, but whatever they want to do, these three need better risk intelligence in order to do their jobs. And they're just not getting it in many cases.
I have a follow-up question there, Craig, because obviously that's an area that speaks very, very much to the heart of Diligent, right? This is sort of what we're trying to do as a company. And I'm curious to know your thoughts about, is it just getting the right data in front of the right eyeballs, or is there a new type of conversation and partnership that needs to exist between, those who are in risk roles and the board and C-suite? Like, I'm just wondering if both things need to be true. Is it really about visibility, or is it about a different kind of collaboration happening from the leadership down to the front lines?
That's an awesome question. I think it's much more about collaboration. Because the other risk here, right, is that somebody gets incredibly inspired by the question that you just asked, and they go out and they do a bunch of stuff. The key challenge that I would have to anybody that is importing risk intelligence is that it needs to be contextualized to the company, culture, language, and strategic planning of your entity. Because otherwise, you are getting exactly the same risk intelligence as your competitors. And it may be very good, but it's very generic and it doesn't help you. And so I think the conversation you're talking about needs to happen because different companies have different needs and different ways of communicating. The commonalities between them is none of them have any excess time and none of them have any extra budget. Despite that, if these things aren't improved, if risk intelligence is not improved, the losses are going to be immense because companies will continue to find themselves reacting at the same time as their competitors. So companies need to take the time, and they probably need to spend the money to a degree in order to get themselves better positioned so they can make investments when the rest of their competitors are retreating from the chaos.
That's really, really good advice. Thank you for that. I also just want to ask you, we've been sort of focusing on these three things, right? Tax policy, regulation, international trade. Are there other trends and developments that leaders should be keeping a close eye on? Maybe things that we haven't been talking about yet, or maybe aren't getting as much airtime in the news cycle. You have such an interesting vantage point. So what's on your mind that leaders should be thinking about?
So you may regret asking me this because I'm going to introduce a concept that you may not like. One thing that I think more companies, especially at the board level, need to be doing is identifying gray rhinos. And for those of you, who are listening that aren't familiar with these, I think there's a fair number of people who know what theoretically a black swan is, right? A completely unforeseen event like the global financial crisis. Gray rhinos are far more common. They are called that because, like a gray rhino out on the horizon, right, you sort of know that's a risk over there. But almost all of the time it stays over there, 500 yards away from you, so it's not a problem. But like rhinos, they can charge at you with incredible speed and with great unpredictability, and all of a sudden become a problem that you are not prepared for. Boards need a list of gray rhinos, and not just for geopolitics, by the way, but for things like workforce, technology, and funding, and the markets, and the cost of capital. What are the things that could happen that they need to have a plan for so that they can react properly in the moment or in the day of? And geopolitically, this can be things like certain countries cutting off critical minerals, or sanctions happening where they didn't expect them, or the outlawing of companies on which they completely rely for 30% of their supply chain. Very little of this is not imaginable. And this gets me to the second thing that I think companies need to do is companies need to avoid failures of imagination. Like in this day and age when there is so much geopolitical disequilibrium, failing to imagine what could happen to the company is not forgivable. You have to do this, not just because it's defensive, but again, because if you do this right, it puts you in a position to accelerate in a world of risk. not just stay static. So I don't know if that answered your question, Dottie, but that would be my answer.
I think it's a great answer. I'm, of course, dying to ask the follow-up, which is, what are the 3 gray rhinos that are keeping you awake most at night? Like, what are the ones that you're watching out on the savannah?
So one of the ones that I am greatly worried about is the return of a global health crisis, because I'm not saying that that's likely, but what could have happened during the last one is it could have been enough of a transnational challenge that you would have had many countries coming together to solve this problem. If we had done it that way, I don't think that the trust meter in geopolitics would be reading on empty, which is what it is doing now. It would be at least half full. And what that means is that if this happened again at the same scale or even close, we are not prepared to cooperate globally, to share data, and to solve problems, to move money around. Like, it's not there. And so if that happened again, I think that is a real challenge. I think one of the other gray rhinos that is out there that worries me is demographics and immigration. The G20 countries in particular are aging very fast, and they are also increasingly hostile or very challenging of immigration policies that are needed to keep GDP growth going. And that's happening in a lot of places in the world. That ultimately leads to a challenge. I think the last gray rhino that I'm worried about is, if you look at how the internet emerged for commercial use in the early 90s, right around the time of the first Gulf War. They almost overlapped, right, in terms of the same day, where the internet opened for commerce and the Gulf War started. And what happened in the Gulf War is the U.S. unleashed a bunch of weaponry that our adversaries had never seen, and it terrified them. And part of what they decided to do was use this new technology called the internet to level the playing field. So instead of investing billions of dollars in hardware and weaponry, they were going to use this asymmetric system on which, by the way, we had built no security. And they were going to exploit it, which they've been doing for the last 35 years. As we are on the verge of AI, I'm seeing the same mistake being made. We are implementing AI without the proper understanding of the data that feeds it and the capability of strategic intelligence services from our adversaries to vastly manipulate that data into tricking us into making very bad decisions as companies. Unless something dramatic is done, we're going to go down the same road.
That is both very terrifying and very helpful. So thank you for sharing that with us.
That's usually how people react to anything I say.
I feel like I could talk to you for days. This is all so interesting to me. I'd love to kind of finish up this part of our interview by asking you to share some insights on how corporate directors can really stay informed and proactive and adapting, as the business landscape is going to evolve rapidly under the Trump administration. It just feels to me like so much of what you read in the news cycle is leaning one direction or another. And so it feels very hyped. So how would you recommend that leaders really keep their finger on the pulse of what is actually happening and not just the noise around what is happening?
Very hyped is a very polite way to say what's going on.
Trying to walk the middle line here, Craig.
Yes, you're doing a good job. So here's what I would say. And I say this because, in large part, a lot of the data that I and my team read, right, is global, because we're trying to understand the world. More than focusing or recommending a source, I would say that people need to understand different global perspectives first. If you are trying to increase your business in Japan and Korea, and all you are reading is U.S. perspectives on Japan and Korea, and not understanding Korean or Japanese perspectives, as difficult as that might be for you, then it's just not going to work. And you may not agree with those points of view, but I think making the time and the effort when you are doing global business to find the reliable, interesting, often divergent, opinionated from you sources from somebody who is local will help. And the way that I have found to do this is you basically ask exactly the same thing you asked. If you're an executive or a board member and you know somebody who is good at Japan and Korea, you say, give me 3 names of people that nobody reads except experts. And you call up those people and you ask for 3 more names each. And, by 3 calls in, you have a list of 27 or 33 different options. But I think understanding how they see themselves and they see us is really important, because it's often very different than what is represented in the U.S. press.
That's really, really good advice. Well, Craig, before we let you go, there are 3 questions that we like to ask every guest who joins us on the podcast. And the first question is, what do you think is the biggest difference between boardrooms today and 10 years from now?
So I know that there's been progress in this area, but I think part of what I would hope is that if the world continues to be as complicated as it is, I think there needs to be more of a varied expertise set in the boardroom so that the kind of conversation that we're having today could regularly be had by almost, any member of the board, because there's a board member or two that has spent their career thinking deeply about this. And that's we've gotten better at that, but I think there should be, and hopefully there will be, more of that.
I love that. What was the last thing that you read or watched or listened to that made you think about governance in a new light?
The last thing that I reread, and it gets to the AI thing, was a book by a guy named Kai-Fu Lee, who wrote a book called AI Superpower several years ago. This is before, all the chat technology came out.
Great book, by the way.
It's a great book. And I wanted to see, does it hold up? And I think it does.
Yeah.
What I like about the way he does this is, and again, this gets you to a different person's point of view. He breaks AI down into different components, especially from a business point of view that we should be thinking about. But I also like how he uses anthropology to explain entry into foreign markets and understanding the culture of that market as being a critical element for foreign investment.
That's a really good recommendation because, we all think about what's the latest book in AI rather than, kind of what's the seminal book in AI, which is really great. So thank you for that recommendation. And finally, Craig, what is your current passion project?
So my current passion project is keeping my smallest dog from attacking my middle one.
Oh, what kind of dogs do you have?
So we have 3 adopted dogs. They're all mutts, and the one that we fostered that we ended up keeping is the youngest, the smallest. She's also the only girl. She's very much in love with the middle one. It is not completely reciprocated, and so a lot of my time every day is spent trying to explain the nature of their relationship to one another. So I'm currently very focused on this.
Well, I hope that unrequited love eventually gets returned.
Hopefully.
Craig, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. This has been a fabulous conversation.
No, thank you for having me. Absolutely fantastic.
We've been joined today by Craig Stronberg, Senior Director at PwC Intelligence. Craig, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
Thanks for that interview, Dottie. Really has my wheels turning. I mean, I feel like we live in a world now where everything is a gray rhino. Everything could just in an instant just turn your business on its head.
Okay, how much did you start to sweat under the collar when he said, my biggest gray rhino fear is another global pandemic? I just thought, oh, Lordy. Yeah. Just I think maybe one of the reasons we're not talking enough about that is because just nobody wants to deal with it. No one wants to go back to 2020 and relive the craziness that we all went through. But sadly, he's right. I mean, we are in this incredibly fractured time, not just in this country, but globally. There is probably the lowest level of international cooperation among governments that we've seen in generations. And if another pandemic hits, the structures that need to be in place to ensure global cooperation just don't exist right now. It is a very concerning reality.
Yeah, and it just makes me think again, how quickly a country, a leader who, has his mind, he or she has his mind set on some particular way of conducting the country. I mean, it could shift so dramatically for multinationals. And I know some of the things that we talk about in terms of tariffs and supply chain and all of those things he said, are not that different necessarily between the Trump and Biden administration, but I don't know. I feel like everything is more unstable than ever.
Well, Megan, that really calls to mind something that Craig said that I just resonated with so strongly because it's something we talk about all the time here at Diligent. And that is that you've got this problem where you've got things like tax policy, regulatory policy, international trade, supply chain, all being handled by different people within the organization. And they all look at different metrics. They have different understandings of risk. And he pointed out quite rightly that in the current geopolitical environment, we have to just rethink that entire process. You really need to have a clear through line from each practitioner up to the board so that everyone's looking at risk kind of the same way and understanding the intricacies of risk, how things interplay with each other. You can't just look at tax policy in a vacuum. You can't just look at international trade in a vacuum. You have to look at all these things as how they connect. And then you also just have to add to that mix that the models that we've had to date for dealing with risk are all based on a world that has a certain set of standards and normal patterns, quote unquote normal. And we just don't live in a world where you can expect normalcy. I mean, even just some of the things that used to work just don't anymore. And that's a global phenomenon. That's not just something in the US. And so I think what message I would take from this, if I'm a corporate director, is we really need to get better line of sight on what's happening with how we're managing and overseeing risk across the company. And we need to have a conversation where we can level set what are the standard criteria and metrics that we are all paying attention to so that we don't miss something. Because as he points out, what happens with, for example, immigration policy, not just in the US, but in other countries, think like Germany, think, what's happening in some of the other sort of major economies in the world, has a major impact on that company's ability to import and export, to be part of the global economy. It has a lot of implications for what happens with inflation. All these things are interconnected. So if you're just looking at risk through one lens, you may be missing really important information that could upend your strategy. And so I thought that was a really astute observation. And what he said is the remedy is better collaboration. I think personally, it's two things. It's both having the same single source of truth with the same metrics, staring everyone in the same face. And then better collaboration around what do we do with this information? Because information is just information until you take action around it, then it becomes insight, right? And so I think there needs to be that single through line, and that level of collaboration just really needs to be rethought and rebuilt, I think. What did you take from that comment, by the way?
Definitely agree there. And I think shameless plug for some of the work that I'm going to be doing at Diligent. This is very much something we are thinking about organizationally in terms of supporting boards and senior leaders when it comes to that one single source of truth across so many disparate and changing aspects of what it means to run a business. I really liked his comments around, the perspectives as well. I think not only the perspectives around the boardroom table, but how you get your information and what it means to go outside of the information that you're getting from your board of directors, getting as a board member from the rest of your leadership team. What does it look like to find other sources to keep you informed and engaged as a board member? I think to really think about things in a different way and to tackle some of these things. I don't know that we'll ever be able to see around corners. That's the whole point of why black swans and gray rhinos and all of these things will continue to exist and evolve. But again, there is a level of preparedness and really challenging thinking around the boardroom that I think needs to happen.
Well, listen, friends, if you, like Megan and I, like to think about all things risk, we have an opportunity for you that might be of interest. Coming up on February 5th and 6th, we have a free virtual cybersecurity risk summit that is taking place at Diligent. You can find all about it at diligent.com. And we would strongly recommend that you consider coming. Cybersecurity, cyber risk, perfect example of the need for better collaboration across the organization, the need for better single source of truth metrics from the front lines all the way up to the boardroom. Everyone needs to be paying attention to this. Cyber is moving very quickly, especially in this age of AI. We're seeing some really terrifying and very successful new kinds of cyber risk. So that cyber summit is going to help you to understand the legal and regulatory frameworks. It's going to help you to understand the risk landscape and what we can expect coming up in the future. We'll be talking about how you build that collaboration that Craig was talking about. So strongly recommend, if that's of interest to you, it's worth checking out. And again, it's free, it's online, costs you nothing to go. So definitely worth your time to check that out. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Corporate Director Podcast, the voice of modern governance. I'm Dottie Schindlinger, and I've been joined by my co-host, Megan Day. I'd like to say a few special thank yous, first and foremost, to our super intelligent intelligence officer from PwC, Craig Stronberg, podcast producers, Kira Ciccarelli and Steve Clayton, and most especially, Diligent Corporation for sponsoring this show. If you like our show, please be sure to give us a rating on your podcast player of choice. 5 stars only, please. You can also listen to our episodes and check out more from Diligent Institute by going to diligent.com/resources. Thank you so much for listening.
You've been listening to the Corporate Director Podcast. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you'd like to learn more about corporate governance and tools to help directors do their job better, visit www.diligent.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.